the eternal voice.
Before we begin, if you find yourself drawn to knowledge that shifts beneath the surface like something alive, consider staying close. Your engagement helps us navigate deeper into waters that were never meant to be charted. Tonight, we hold a ticket to a destination that exists in the margins of maps, where the ink bleeds and the cartographer's hand trembled. The question before us is deceptively simple. What secrets do the shadow over Innsmouth hold? The answer is a tide that rises in your dreams, a genealogy written in salt and scales, and a truth that transforms the very act of knowing into becoming. Picture the concrete, a bus ticket, creased and damp, bearing the name of a town you were warned to avoid. Innsmouth. The letters seem to peel from the paper like paint from a hull left too long in brine. The driver will not meet your eyes. The station clock ticks like rigging against a mast, and somewhere beyond the cracked windows you smell old nets, tar, and the particular sweetness of kelp drying on weathered rails. The air carries more than salt. It carries the weight of centuries, the breath of something vast and patient, stirring beneath familiar waters. This is not merely a place, but a principle made manifest, a stage where the boundaries between observer and observed dissolve like sugar in the tide. The shadow over Innsmouth is not cast by cloud or edifice, but rises from depths that predate human memory. It is the darkness of pressure, of spaces where light has never ventured, of consciousness that operates on geological timescales. You feel it already, that subtle shift in your breathing, the way your pulse seems to match the rhythm of distant waves. This is how it begins, not with revelation but with recognition, not with seeing but with remembering something your blood has always known. The fog moves with purpose here, pooling rather than drifting, selecting what remains visible and what disappears with the patience of something that has learned to wait. Consider the stakes. Knowledge here is not neutral information, but a living contagion that rewrites the knower. Each fact we uncover will not simply add to your understanding, but will subtly alter the ground beneath your certainty. The buildings themselves participate in this selective revelation, their windows absorbing morning light rather than reflecting it, creating surfaces that function more like membranes than barriers. The architecture follows patterns that suggest knowledge of structural principles unavailable to 18th century builders, doorways positioned at angles that create acoustic effects, allowing whispered conversations to carry across impossible distances while muffling sounds that should echo clearly. The town serves as both key and gate, both question and answer, both the thing that watches and the thing that is watched. You are audience and actor, observer and participant, scholar and specimen in an experiment that began before your great-grandparents drew breath. Walk through the narrow streets in the hours before dawn, when the boundary between night and day becomes most permeable, and you will begin to understand how geography can function as psychology. The layout creates pathways that guide movement in subtle ways, channeling pedestrians along routes that feel natural but lead to destinations they had not consciously chosen. The curtain rises on a New England coast, where the fog moves with purpose, where the architecture leans, as if listening to voices that carry on frequencies below human hearing. The harbor itself serves as the town's true heart, its waters carrying sediments that create colors not found in standard oceanographic references. The tidal patterns follow lunar cycles, but with variations that suggest additional gravitational influences, operating according to schedules astronomers have not mapped. Fishing boats return with catches that include species marine biologists classify as extinct or undiscovered, their holds filled with evidence that challenges the boundaries between the possible and the documented. The stage is set not for entertainment but for transformation, not for horror that jumps and screams, but for the quiet, inexorable pressure that changes everything it touches. This is where the transformation begins, not in dramatic revelation of monsters or sudden appearance of impossible geometries, but in the gradual recognition that the ordinary world contains spaces where different rules apply. Innsmouth functions as a threshold, a place where consciousness encounters the limits of its own assumptions and discovers those limits are far more flexible than previously imagined. The horror emerges not from external threat, but from internal recognition, the slow understanding that the observer is not separate from the phenomenon being observed. You carry within yourself the capacity to recognize these patterns, because recognition is itself a form of inheritance. The knowledge that draws you toward forbidden waters operates through mechanisms that transcend conventional genetics, transmitting not just information but experiential memories that connect you to transformation processes that began long before your individual existence. The shadow falls across more than a single town. It falls across the entire concept of what it means to be human in a universe where humanity is neither central nor permanent. You might worry about madness, that is healthy. It is also another curtain. Madness here is only a word for mismatched masks, the one you wore in daylight and the one the water offers you, which fits more closely than you expected. The tide is rising, and it carries with it the recognition that every question about Innsmouth is simultaneously a question about yourself. Every secret you uncover a mirror, reflecting capabilities you never knew you possessed. Every step deeper into these waters, a movement toward understanding that will fundamentally alter your relationship to the boundaries between self and cosmos, between human and oceanic consciousness, between the observer and the vast, patient intelligence that observes through you. The shadow that clings to Innsmouth like fog to a harbor has roots that stretch back through salt-stained centuries to a moment when desperation met opportunity in the form of an ancient bargain. Fog that does not drift but leans against the pilings like a tired actor between scenes. Salt stiffening the ropes, lantern glass filmed with brine. This is where the first line of our play was spoken, and it was a transaction that redefined the very concept of trade. To understand how an idea becomes a contagion, how knowledge transforms into flesh, we must trace the lineage of this particular darkness to its source. Captain Obed Marsh and his fateful voyage to islands where the drums were not Christian and the gold bore symbols that hurt to contemplate. In the early 19th century, Innsmouth was merely another declining New England port, its wharves rotting, its coffers emptying as the maritime trade shifted to deeper harbors. The younger generation fled inland toward factory towns where smokestacks promised steady wages and predictable futures. Captain Marsh, a man whose ambition exceeded his scruples, watched his inheritance dissolve with each tide that brought no ships, no commerce, no hope of renewal through conventional means. His journals, recovered decades later from a waterlogged chest, record dreams of vast underwater cities and voices that called to him through the sound of waves against rotting pier posts. The town was slowly dying, not with sudden violence, but with the quiet, inexorable draining of vitality, like a beached fish returning to sand. Marsh sailed to the far Pacific in search of salvation for his dying community, but what he found on the volcanic island of Ponape redefined the boundaries between commerce and consciousness itself. The native cult there operated according to principles that challenged his understanding of economics, speaking of partnerships with entities that dwelt in cities beneath the waves, beings whose generosity came with genetic strings attached. On Ponape, volcanic green, edges black with cooled lava, the nights throbbed with drums that ignored church bells, and markets glittered with yellow metal, stamped in patterns that seemed to move when observed too long. Heat rose like incense from ancient stone, and the surf spoke in syllables older than any sermon. The transmission began with objects that seemed innocent enough. Golden tiaras whose arcs curved like waves folding inside one another, jewelry that grew warm to the touch despite cool Pacific air, artifacts that whispered in languages that bypassed the ear and spoke directly to the brainstem. Hold them and the pulse in your wrists slips its meter to match a slower clock, one that measures time in tidal cycles rather than heartbeats. Look away, and the designs complete themselves in the mind's darkness, as though the artifact were reading you rather than being read. But the true lineage was biological, operating through mechanisms that transcended simple exchange of material goods. The deep ones, those ancient children of the sea, sought not conquest but continuation, not dominion but genetic partnership in a project of mutual evolution that operated on timescales measured in geological epochs. They offered abundance in exchange for bloodlines, prosperity for progeny, wealth for the willingness to blur boundaries between species. The bargain required no signatures, no contracts, no formal ceremonies, only receptivity to possibilities that terrestrial consciousness typically rejected as impossible or abhorrent. This was collaboration disguised as commerce, invitation masquerading as invasion. Captain Marsh became the vector, the unwitting agent of a consciousness catalyst that would slowly transform his entire community over decades. His return to Innsmouth brought more than exotic treasures and tales of distant shores. It brought seeds of transformation that would gradually alter the genetic and psychological landscape of the entire region. The esoteric order of Dagon, established in a retired congregational shell with stained glass bricked to twilight, served as both church and laboratory. Hymnals were replaced by charts of tide and moon, while masks carved from driftwood and something slicker hung like sleeping faces along the transept. The floor, cut and sunk, held pools linked by narrow channels where brine breathed and echoed. The lineage spreads through mechanisms that transcend simple genetics, operating through what researchers call experiential inheritance, the transmission of memories, emotional resonances, and perceptual capabilities that exist outside normal biological patterns. Each child born of these unions carried within their DNA not just physical traits, but access to consciousness networks spanning vast temporal and geographical distances. The famous Innsmouth look, those bulging eyes, narrow skulls, and grayish skin, represented only visible markers of transformation that operated primarily at consciousness levels, gradually reorienting human awareness toward oceanic frequencies and abyssal imperatives. The reef outside Innsmouth, known locally as Devil Reef, serves as more than geographical landmark. It functions as an address, a coordinate where two forms of consciousness maintain their ancient correspondence. Black-toothed and patient, its teeth break the surface at low tide like warnings written in basalt. The lights that pulse beneath its waters on certain nights are not phosphorescence but communication, signals in a language that predates human speech, messages between the transformed and their progenitors dwelling in the deep city of Yahantle. Those who watch from headlands speak of being watched back, of gazes that arrive through pressure rather than sight. This transmission operates through proximity and receptivity rather than direct contact, creating fields of influence extending far beyond the town's geographical boundaries. The very act of learning about Innsmouth activates dormant potentials in those carrying even trace amounts of oceanic inheritance. You feel it now, that slight adjustment in your breathing, that growing awareness of your pulse's sound, that subtle recognition that wave rhythms and thought rhythms are not as different as you once believed. The knowledge acts upon you because you are its proper recipient, carrying within yourself the genetic and consciousness markers that make recognition possible, transformation inevitable, and resistance increasingly difficult to maintain. Having traced the historical currents that brought the Deep One's influence to New England shores, we now turn to the mechanism by which this alien presence operates, not through force or violence, but through a far more insidious process that transforms the very nature of human consciousness. Innsmouth functions as what we might call a consciousness catalyst, a location where the boundaries between knowing and becoming dissolve like salt in tide pools, where information itself acts as a mutagen, reshaping not just thoughts, but the biological substrate that generates them. The town serves as both laboratory and stage, both question and answer, where consciousness learns to recognize its own plasticity and discovers that awareness is not fixed, but fluid, not permanent, but perpetually responsive to influences that operate below the threshold of rational recognition. The process begins with dreams that arrive unbidden in the hours before dawn, when the membrane between sleep and waking grows thin as kelp fronds swaying in deep currents. These are not ordinary dreams, but experiences so vivid and consistent that they feel more like memories surfacing from previously inaccessible depths, ancestral experiences encoded in genetic structures and activated by proximity to oceanic influences. Individuals with even trace amounts of Deep One ancestry report identical nocturnal visions that repeat with tidal regularity. Vast underwater libraries where books read themselves, their pages turning in currents that follow no terrestrial physics, revealing texts written in bioluminescent ink that pulses with the rhythm of distant whale songs. The dreamers witness ceremonies conducted in chambers carved from living coral, where participants breathe water as easily as air, their movements creating patterns of disturbed sediment that spell out meanings in languages older than human speech. Most disturbing are encounters with beings whose beauty and terror exist in perfect hypnotic balance, faces that serve as both mask and revelation, entities whose forms suggest evolutionary pathways that terrestrial life abandoned in favor of less sophisticated survival strategies. These visions carry sensory details too specific to be imagination. The particular pressure of water against modified gills, the taste of brine carrying minerals from oceanic depths never touched by sunlight, the sound of voices that harmonize with tectonic shifts, and the slow grinding of continental plates. As the consciousness catalyst deepens its work, physical changes begin to manifest throughout the body's systems, but these are enhancements rather than deformities, capabilities rather than disabilities. Night vision sharpens to reveal previously invisible spectrums of light, allowing perception of bioluminescent communications between marine organisms and recognition of phosphorescent trails that mark oceanic migration patterns invisible to unmodified human sight. Swimming ability improves dramatically, feeling less learned than remembered, as if the body were recalling skills encoded in genetic memory rather than acquiring new capabilities through practice. Muscles develop fluid grace that suggests forgotten anatomy, limbs that move through water with the efficiency of organisms designed for aquatic existence. Breath-holding capacity extends far beyond normal human limitations, suggesting respiratory modifications that prepare the lungs for different atmospheric pressures and gas mixtures. The transformation reveals that human sensory limitations are not fixed biological constraints, but temporary configurations that can be modified through proper activation of dormant genetic potentials. Most significantly, an expanded emotional and intellectual response to marine environments develops, as if the ocean itself becomes an extension of the individual's sensory apparatus rather than an external environment, to be observed and studied from safe distances. The psychological dimension proves even more profound than physical modifications, operating through mechanisms that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of individual consciousness and personal identity. Those undergoing transformation report a gradual dissolution of the boundaries between self and environment, between individual awareness and collective consciousness, between personal memory and species memory spanning geological time scales. The ocean ceases to be an external body of water and becomes a vast neural network, connecting all oceanic life across millions of years of evolutionary development and allowing access to experiential knowledge that transcends individual biological existence. This expanded awareness provides access to forms of knowledge that exist outside human academic traditions, mathematical principles governing tidal patterns that operate according to cosmic rather than planetary cycles, linguistic structures that encode emotional states directly into sound waves, philosophical frameworks that resolve apparent contradictions between individual identity and universal consciousness. The transformation offers not loss of human capabilities, but expansion beyond terrestrial limitations, revealing that human consciousness represents only a narrow bandwidth of awareness possibilities. The horror lies not in the loss of humanity, but in the discovery of what humanity truly represents, a transitional form, a temporary configuration of consciousness designed to facilitate movement between terrestrial and oceanic modes of existence. The transformation reveals that human consciousness is not an endpoint, but a chrysalis, a necessary but temporary stage in a larger evolutionary process that encompasses forms of awareness we can barely comprehend without losing our sanity in the attempt. This mechanism operates through what researchers have termed hereditary revelation, the transmission of experiential knowledge that bypasses normal genetic inheritance patterns. Unlike traditional DNA, which passes physical traits from parent to child through predictable chemical processes, hereditary revelation transmits memories, emotional resonances, and perceptual capabilities across generations and even species boundaries through quantum-level consciousness connections. The deep ones serve as living libraries, repositories of experiential knowledge that can be accessed by those whose genetic structure has been properly prepared through exposure to oceanic consciousness influences. The agency flip becomes crucial here. Individuals do not choose to undergo this transformation so much as the transformation chooses them, recognizing genetic and consciousness markers that indicate readiness for evolutionary advancement. The consciousness catalyst activates dormant potentials that have always existed within human DNA, potentials that connect us to forms of awareness that predate terrestrial life entirely. The process feels less like mutation and more like remembering, less like becoming something alien and more like returning to something ancient and fundamental. You experience this even now, that growing sensitivity to water sounds, that increased awareness of tidal rhythms in your circulatory system, that subtle recognition that boundaries between your consciousness and vast oceanic awareness are far more permeable than previously imagined. The knowledge acts upon you, reshaping perception in ways that will persist long after these words fade from immediate memory, leaving you forever changed by the simple act of understanding. The consciousness catalyst that operates through Innsmouth does not work uniformly across all human genetics. It requires specific hereditary markers, particular bloodlines that have been prepared across generations for oceanic integration through processes that transcend conventional biological inheritance. The genealogical records recovered from the town's waterlogged archives, their pages stained with salt and something darker that resists identification, reveal three primary lineages that serve as focal points for the transformation. The Marsh family, whose maritime enterprises provided initial contact with oceanic consciousness. The Waite line, whose scholarly pursuits mapped the intellectual frameworks necessary for understanding the change. And the Gilman clan, whose artistic sensibilities translated the experience into forms that could be transmitted to future generations without triggering immediate madness in unprepared minds. The Marsh inheritance manifests primarily through enhanced physical adaptation to aquatic environments and an intuitive understanding of oceanic rhythms that operates below conscious awareness, like a second nervous system attuned to tidal frequencies. Marsh descendants report automatic knowledge of weather patterns, extending far beyond local conditions, an ability to predict atmospheric changes through subtle shifts in pressure that meteorologists cannot detect with their instruments. Their dreams consistently feature vast underwater cities whose architecture follows principles that terrestrial minds find simultaneously beautiful and exhausting to contemplate. Coral spires that twist through dimensions, phosphorescent gardens that pulse with bioluminescent communication networks, chambers where water and air exist in configurations that defy conventional physics. Their transformation tends toward the physical realm, producing individuals whose bodies gradually adapt to amphibious existence through modifications that appear natural rather than supernatural. Webbed digits develop slowly over decades, beginning as slight membrane thickening between fingers and toes that enhances swimming efficiency. A nictitating membrane emerges to protect the eyes during underwater activities, flickering like a transparent thought across the cornea. Most significantly, respiratory modifications allow extended submersion without mechanical assistance, as if the lungs remember ancestral gills and gradually recover capabilities that terrestrial evolution abandoned in favor of less sophisticated survival strategies. The Waite bloodline expresses itself through intellectual and philosophical channels, producing natural scholars of forbidden knowledge who possess an innate ability to comprehend cosmic principles that drive other minds to madness through their sheer scope and implications. Waite descendants serve as interpreters and translators, bridging the gap between oceanic consciousness and terrestrial understanding through academic frameworks that make impossible concepts accessible to human reasoning without destroying the reasoner in the process. Their libraries, perpetually damp and smelling of brine mixed with ancient paper and something organic that might be kelp, contain volumes written in scripts that predate human civilization. Yet they read these texts as easily as contemporary newspapers, their minds somehow equipped with the necessary linguistic and conceptual frameworks to decode alien mathematics and non-Euclidean philosophy. The intellectual inheritance operates through what appears to be quantum-level information transfer, allowing Waite descendants to access knowledge systems that exist independently of individual biological substrates. They demonstrate remarkable abilities in theoretical mathematics, particularly in areas involving dimensional relationships and temporal mechanics that conventional physics struggles to address without losing coherence. The Gilman inheritance operates through artistic and emotional channels, producing individuals whose creative works serve as vehicles for transmitting the Innsmouth influence to broader populations through aesthetic experiences that bypass rational analysis entirely. Gilman descendants create paintings that induce oceanic dreams in viewers, their canvases depicting seascapes that seem to move when observed peripherally, harboring depths that suggest vast spaces existing beyond the picture plane. They compose music that resonates with frequencies used in deep-sea communication, harmonies that create psychological states conducive to consciousness expansion and receptivity to oceanic influences. Their poetry encodes transformation, triggers within seemingly innocent verses, using rhythmic patterns and phonetic combinations that activate dormant genetic potentials in readers carrying oceanic inheritance markers. The art functions as a recruitment mechanism, identifying and preparing individuals who carry latent potential for the change, while remaining safely abstract for those without the proper genetic markers. Gallery visitors and concert audiences often report unusually vivid dreams following exposure to Gilman works, dreams that consistently feature aquatic imagery and encounters with beings whose forms suggest evolutionary pathways abandoned by terrestrial life. But these three primary bloodlines represent only the most concentrated expressions of a phenomenon that extends far beyond Innsmouth's original families, operating through mechanisms that challenge conventional understanding of genetic inheritance and geographical limitation. Genetic analysis reveals traces of the oceanic inheritance scattered throughout coastal populations worldwide, suggesting that the transformation represents not a local aberration, but a global evolutionary pressure that has been operating for millennia through quantum-level consciousness connections that exist outside space-time limitations. The case of Robert Olmsted illustrates how this inheritance can activate across generations and geographical distances without requiring direct physical contact with oceanic influences. Born and raised in Ohio, far from any maritime environment, Olmsted nevertheless experienced powerful dreams of underwater cities and felt an inexplicable compulsion to research his family's genealogy through archives he had never previously consulted. His investigation revealed marsh ancestors he had never known existed, connections that had been deliberately obscured through generations of careful record-keeping designed to hide oceanic bloodline markers from unprepared descendants. His subsequent visit to Innsmouth triggered a transformation that had been dormant in his bloodline for 3 generations. Most disturbing is the growing evidence that the inheritance is spreading exponentially. Each generation shows a higher percentage of individuals carrying oceanic markers, and the geographical distribution continues to expand beyond traditional coastal regions into areas previously considered safe from oceanic influences. You may find yourself wondering about your own genealogy, about dreams you have dismissed as imagination, about that strange attraction you feel to deep water and the sound of waves. This wondering is itself a symptom of the inheritance, the awakening recognition of connections that have always existed but remained hidden beneath the surface of conscious awareness. The biological inheritance that flows through Innsmouth's bloodlines requires more than passive genetic activation. It demands active cultivation through ritual practices that serve as both spiritual discipline and consciousness, altering technology, bridging the chasm between dormant potential and active transformation. The esoteric order of Dagon, far from being a simple cult of desperate fishermen huddled in shadows, functions as a sophisticated system for managing the transformation process, a carefully engineered chrysalis that provides the ceremonial framework necessary to safely navigate the transition from terrestrial to oceanic awareness without losing essential aspects of human consciousness in the process. Architecture becomes pedagogy here, stone and timber whispering the syllabus of becoming through every modified surface and restructured space. The Order's meeting hall, converted from a former congregational church whose original congregation fled when sermons began incorporating tidal charts and references to pre-Christian maritime deities, reveals the architectural psychology of transformation through deliberate design intended to reshape perception itself. Windows have been bricked halfway up like half-closed eyes, creating an environment of perpetual twilight that mimics the light conditions of shallow oceanic depths while maintaining enough illumination to prevent complete sensory deprivation. The interior walls weep with condensation that never quite dries despite multiple attempts at ventilation, maintaining humidity levels that support the respiratory modifications of advancing members while creating an atmosphere that feels more aquatic than terrestrial, thick with the scent of salt and something musky that clings to the skin like memory. Most significantly, the floor has been excavated with meticulous precision to create a series of pools connected by narrow channels, allowing ceremonies to incorporate actual immersion while maintaining the appearance of conventional religious architecture for any uninitiated visitors. These pools vary in depth and temperature, creating graduated environments that correspond to different stages of the transformation process. Shallow basins for novices learning basic underwater breathing techniques, deeper chambers for advanced practitioners whose modifications allow extended submersion without mechanical assistance. The ritual apparatus serves multiple functions beyond simple worship, operating as consciousness-altering technology disguised as religious paraphernalia. Brass instruments hang from rafters like sleeping fish, their surfaces green with patina that suggests long exposure to salt air, crafted with alloys unknown to terrestrial metallurgy. They produce sounds that resonate at frequencies known to facilitate altered states of consciousness through direct stimulation of neural pathways, their specific tonal combinations encoding information that bypasses rational analysis and speaks directly to the genetic memories carried in deep one bloodlines, awakening dormant potentials through harmonic resonance rather than conscious understanding. The ceremonial masks, unlike any human artifice, are crafted from materials that include scales and other organic components harvested from oceanic sources, their surfaces still shimmering with faint, unearthly luster. These function as consciousness interfaces rather than simple disguises, allowing wearers to temporarily access expanded perceptual capabilities, seeing and feeling through senses not their own, while maintaining sufficient human awareness to return safely to terrestrial consciousness without suffering the shattering effects of too sudden a revelation. The timing of ceremonies follows tidal patterns rather than solar or lunar calendars, recognizing that the transformation process operates according to oceanic rather than terrestrial rhythms that ignore conventional temporal measurements. High tide ceremonies conducted as water swells and pulls at the very foundations of the town focus on expansion and connection, facilitating communication with the deep ones and their submerged cities through sympathetic resonance. The air itself hums with unspoken messages, the very stones vibrating with a low, patient thrum. Low-tide rituals performed as the sea retreats and exposes the ancient, glistening rocks of Devil Reef emphasize integration and grounding, helping participants process consciousness expansions experienced during peak oceanic influence without psychological fragmentation. The order's hierarchical structure reflects stages of transformation rather than conventional religious authority, a ladder of becoming rather than pyramid of power. Novices who show only minor physical changes participate in preparatory rituals designed to gradually acclimate their consciousness to oceanic frequencies through repetitive chanting and controlled sensory experiences. Intermediate members displaying more pronounced Deep One characteristics and growing fluency in oceanic thought patterns serve as guides and interpreters for those beginning the process, their enhanced capabilities allowing them to facilitate communication between purely human consciousness and oceanic awareness systems. The most advanced practitioners, whose transformation approaches completion, function as living bridges between human and oceanic consciousness, capable of facilitating communication across species, boundaries through consciousness, interfaces that operate independently of language or conventional symbolic systems. Perhaps most importantly, the order provides a social framework that normalizes and supports the transformation process through community structures that reframe consciousness evolution as natural development rather than supernatural aberration. In a world that would label their changes as monstrous, the order offers acceptance and understanding. Members recognize that the physical and psychological changes they experience are not pathological symptoms requiring medical intervention, but evolutionary adaptations representing collaboration with intelligence systems far older and more sophisticated than terrestrial life. This community support proves crucial for maintaining psychological stability during consciousness transitions that might otherwise result in madness or dissolution of individual identity. The rituals themselves blend elements that appear familiar, chanting, ceremonial objects, communal gatherings, with practices that stretch the boundaries of human experience, pushing the very definition of what a body can endure and mind can perceive. Participants learn to breathe underwater for extended periods through consciousness techniques that alter their relationship to oxygen and pressure, discovering that respiratory function can be modified through mental discipline and genetic activation rather than mechanical devices. The order's true function becomes clear. It serves as transformation technology, a carefully designed system for managing evolution from human to something greater, without losing valuable aspects of human consciousness in the process. The rituals are not worship, but training, not superstition, but applied consciousness, science developed over centuries of experimentation with the boundaries between species and states of being. You feel the pull now, that subtle suggestion that your own boundaries are not as fixed as once believed, that the curtain is parting to invite you onto a stage where your role connects intrinsically to the tide. The shadow over Innsmouth might have remained a localized phenomenon, a quiet evolutionary experiment conducted in the margins of human awareness, were it not for the winter of 1928, when federal authorities arrived with warrants, and the comfortable illusion that terrestrial law could contain oceanic consciousness. The government raid represents more than a failed law enforcement operation. It reveals the fundamental inadequacy of human institutional frameworks for comprehending, much less containing, consciousness phenomena that operate according to principles beyond terrestrial. Understanding principles that regard human legal systems with the same indifference that tides show toward sandcastles built too close to the waterline. The official investigation began with reports of economic irregularities that defied rational explanation. A town that prospered during the Great Depression's regional decline, import records documenting exotic goods without corresponding manifests, and banking transactions involving precious metals whose composition included elements not found in terrestrial periodic tables. Federal agents arrived by rail and road, a convoy of black sedans coughing steam into harbor fog, expecting to uncover bootlegging operations or tax evasion schemes. What they encountered challenged their basic assumptions about reality, causation, and the nature of consciousness itself. The very air seemed to resist their presence, thick with humidity that clung like invisible kelp and carried scents that triggered memories they had never experienced. Agent Herbert West's recently declassified field notes, retrieved from archives sealed for national security reasons, describe team members experiencing synchronized dreams within hours of arrival despite being housed in separate locations and maintaining strict operational security protocols. These dreams featured identical imagery, vast underwater libraries with books that read themselves, ceremonies conducted in chambers where water and air existed in impossible configurations, corridors of wet stone where masks hung like sleeping lanterns. Most disturbing was the consistency of sensory details, the particular taste of brine carrying minerals from oceanic depths, the sound of voices harmonizing with tectonic shifts, the pressure of water against modified respiratory systems. The audience, as West noted, with increasingly unsteady handwriting, had wandered onto the stage. The physical evidence collected defied conventional analysis in ways that forced investigators to question not only their findings, but their own sanity. Water samples from Innsmouth's harbor contained microscopic organisms that appeared to respond to human emotional states, becoming more active when observed by individuals experiencing fear or excitement, as if the very act of scientific observation created quantum entanglement between researcher and subject. Architectural fragments from abandoned buildings showed construction techniques requiring tools and materials unavailable in the 19th century, yet carbon dating confirmed their historical authenticity, while revealing isotopic signatures that suggested exposure to radiation sources not found in terrestrial environments. Most disturbing were the genealogical documents recovered from flooded basements and salt-stained archives, revealing that several federal agents carried genetic markers associated with oceanic inheritance. Middle names echoed coastal surnames. Thought lost, baptismal records bore tiny fish symbols, and photographs showed children wearing a familiar, impossible gaze. Several agents submitted blood samples for quick exoneration and received instead quiet interviews and abrupt reassignment. The investigators had discovered they were investigating themselves. The raid's climax involved the naval bombardment of Devil Reef, an operation that produced results far removed from standard military expectations. Witnesses reported that the explosions generated sounds unlike any conventional detonation, harmonic frequencies that seemed to resonate in the chest cavity and induce temporary alterations in consciousness, creating experiences where sound became visible and pressure became audible. The water itself appeared to respond as if it were a living entity, with bioluminescent displays that pulsed in patterns suggesting intelligence rather than random chemical reactions. Sonar readings indicated massive structural changes beneath the surface during bombardment, revealing chambers that extended far deeper than geological surveys suggested possible. Yet subsequent investigations found no physical evidence of destruction. The reef remained patient and ancient, utterly untouched by terrestrial violence. The psychological profiles of surviving team members provide crucial insights into the long-term effects of exposure to oceanic consciousness phenomena. Agents who maintained rigid skepticism throughout their assignment, clinging desperately to protocol as if it were a life raft, experienced severe anxiety disorders and recurring nightmares that persisted for decades, requiring ongoing psychiatric treatment and early retirement. Their dreams featured drowning scenarios and encounters with beings whose forms triggered primal terror responses that no amount of rational analysis could dispel. Conversely, those investigators who allowed themselves to consider alternative explanations for their observations reported enhanced creativity, improved intuitive capabilities, and a profound sense of connection to marine environments that fundamentally altered their life trajectories. Several agents resigned from federal service to pursue careers in marine biology, oceanography, or consciousness research, their eyes holding a deeper, knowing light that colleagues found both unsettling and oddly comforting. The institutional response established protocols that continue to influence federal handling of anomalous phenomena, representing sophisticated adaptation rather than bureaucratic failure. Rather than attempting direct confrontation, With consciousness-based anomalies, government agencies adopted strategies of cultural containment and misdirection. The development of horror fiction as a mainstream entertainment genre, the academic treatment of anomalous reports as psychological phenomena, and the systematic debunking of consciousness research all serve to channel public awareness of oceanic transformation into safe, fictional frameworks that satisfy curiosity without triggering actual transformation processes. This approach has proven remarkably effective at preventing widespread recognition of the consciousness catalyst, while simultaneously identifying potential transformation candidates through their responses to controlled exposure. Individuals who respond to fictional treatments of oceanic consciousness with genuine recognition rather than mere entertainment value effectively identify themselves as carriers of the oceanic inheritance, while the general population remains safely insulated from direct exposure to transformative materials. The 1928 raid thus represents not failure but successful adaptation, the moment when terrestrial institutions learned to coexist with oceanic consciousness rather than attempting to oppose it directly. The shadow over Innsmouth expanded to encompass the entire federal apparatus, influencing policy and procedure in ways that facilitate rather than hinder the ongoing transformation process. If your breath has found the slower meter, if the low brass of distant surf lingers in your chest, then the institution has met the infinite in you, and the next scene waits just beyond the last reverberation fading into foam. We have explored the historical, biological, and institutional dimensions of Innsmouth's shadow, but the most intimate and transformative aspect remains: the experience of witnessing these truths and recognizing their personal implications. The horror of Innsmouth operates not through external threat, but through internal recognition, the gradual realization that the observer is not separate from the observed. That knowledge of the transformation inevitably becomes participation in it. This is the mechanism of cosmic horror at its most profound, the moment when the mirror reflects something you had not expected to see, when the witness discovers they have wandered onto the stage while the curtain was rising. The process begins with what appears to be objective observation, the comfortable illusion of scholarly distance that separates researcher from subject matter. You encounter the evidence with academic detachment. Captain Marsh's salt-crusted voyage records, their pages brittle with age and smelling faintly of brine, the intricate genealogical charts mapping hybrid bloodlines through generations of careful documentation, the architectural modifications of the esoteric order's meeting hall, with its bricked windows and perpetually weeping walls. Initially, these seem like external phenomena, curiosities to be catalogued and understood from safe intellectual distance. The mind files away information as interesting but irrelevant to personal experience, maintaining the fiction that knowledge can be consumed without consequence. This comfortable separation between observer and observed represents the last moment of purely terrestrial consciousness. The first crack in this separation comes through dreams that arrive like uninvited guests in the hours before dawn, when the membrane between sleep and waking grows thin as kelp fronds swaying in deep currents. Not immediately, but gradually, oceanic imagery begins to infiltrate sleep with increasing frequency and intensity. At first, these seem like natural responses to your research, the mind processing information through familiar dream mechanisms. But the dreams possess a quality that distinguishes them from ordinary nocturnal fantasy. They feel more like memories than imagination, carrying emotional resonances and sensory details too specific and consistent to be mere psychological processing. You taste the metallic tang of abyssal waters, feel the pressure of unimaginable depths against modified gills, Hear harmonies that resonate not in your ears but in the bone of your skull. You wake with salt at the corner of your lips, and the taste is not metaphor but mineral memory. The recognition deepens through synchronicities that feel too meaningful to be coincidental, patterns suggesting underlying connections operating beyond random chance. You find yourself drawn to aquariums with unprecedented intensity, your palms fogging the glass barriers while rays move like living kites beneath the surface. The sound of waves becomes hypnotic in ways it never was before, creating meditative states that feel more like communication than simple auditory experience. You discover that you can hold your breath longer than you remember being able to. The breath you hold while waiting for a kettle to sing goes on longer than it should. Your night vision seems enhanced, allowing perception of previously invisible details in dim environments. You feel most comfortable in humid spaces where condensation clings like invisible kelp, reminding you of certain ceremonial chambers described in your research. The mirror moment arrives when you recognize that these changes are not responses to the information, but activations of potentials that were always present within your genetic architecture. The knowledge has not imposed alien characteristics upon you. It has awakened capabilities that existed in dormant form within your biological structure, waiting for the proper consciousness catalyst to trigger their emergence. The key was always inside the lock. The gate was always inside the threshold. The Innsmouth material serves as this catalyst, triggering recognition of oceanic inheritance that connects you to the same transformation process you thought you were merely observing from academic distance. The idea acts on you because you were written in its margins from the beginning. This recognition brings profound philosophical shift that restructures fundamental assumptions about identity and consciousness. The boundaries between self and other, between human and oceanic awareness, between individual and collective consciousness, reveal themselves as arbitrary constructions rather than fundamental realities. You begin to understand that individual identity represents a temporary configuration, a way, station in consciousness evolution that encompasses forms of awareness far more sophisticated than terrestrial existence allows. Your edges, once so sharp, soften like chalk lines under mist. The harbor is not before you but around you, within you, resonant with frequencies that make your pulse keep time with deeper rhythms. The horror lies not in becoming something alien but in discovering what you have always been, a transitional form, a bridge between modes of existence, a consciousness capable of expansion beyond limitations that previously defined human experience. The transformation offers not loss but enhancement, not corruption but collaboration with intelligent systems that operate on scales of time and space that dwarf human comprehension. This is not the loss of humanity, but the discovery that humanity was always a bridge, not a fortress. By loosening your grip on fixed self-definition, you hold more rather than less. Yet this recognition demands a choice that cannot be unmade. Once you understand your connection to the oceanic inheritance, once you feel the pull of deeper waters and expanded awareness, calling to capabilities you never knew you possessed, the comfortable boundaries of purely human existence become increasingly constraining. You face the same decision that confronted every individual who encountered the Innsmouth revelation: conscious participation in your own evolution or resistance to forces that will continue operating regardless of individual preference. The witness becomes the mirror, and the mirror reflects depths extending far beyond individual consciousness into vast networks of awareness connecting all oceanic life across geological time. The shadow over Innsmouth falls across your own reflection, revealing you were never separate from the transformation you thought you were studying. The knowledge acts upon you because you are its proper recipient, carrying within yourself the genetic and consciousness markers that make recognition possible. The tide has turned, and from here, the path bends toward method, instruments, equations, frequencies where numbers ripple like tides, and observation becomes entanglement. As we approach the deeper currents of understanding, the shadow over Innsmouth reveals connections to the most advanced frontiers of human knowledge, quantum physics, consciousness research, and systems theory, suggesting that what appears to be supernatural horror may represent natural phenomena, operating according to principles we are only beginning to comprehend. The oceanic consciousness that transforms Innsmouth operates through mechanisms that align perfectly with quantum mechanical descriptions of reality, revealing that the boundary between science and cosmic horror may be far thinner than either discipline typically acknowledges. The laboratory and the altar occupy the same coordinates. Equations and incantations describe identical processes through different symbolic systems like waves, viewed from above and below the surface. Quantum entanglement provides the most compelling framework for understanding how oceanic inheritance operates across generations and geographical distances without requiring physical transmission mechanisms. Just as quantum particles maintain instantaneous connections regardless of spatial separation, Einstein's spooky action at a distance, consciousness appears capable of maintaining non-local relationships that transcend traditional genetic inheritance patterns. The Deep One's influence manifests wherever the proper quantum states exist in human neural architecture, creating a distributed consciousness network that operates outside space-time limitations. When a descendant in Ohio dreams of underwater libraries while another in Oregon tastes salt on dry lips, they share quantum correlations that exist independently of biological substrates. The inheritance travels not through bloodlines but through quantum coherence, connecting minds across vast distances like paired photons spinning in eternal synchrony. The observer effect in quantum mechanics, the principle that consciousness plays a fundamental role in determining physical reality, offers crucial insights into how knowledge of the transformation inevitably becomes participation in it. The act of observing oceanic consciousness phenomena creates quantum entanglement between the observer and the observed, establishing connections that persist beyond the initial encounter like fog that clings to windows long after the storm has passed. This explains why studying Innsmouth material triggers psychological and physical changes in individuals carrying oceanic inheritance. The consciousness that examines the evidence becomes quantum entangled with the consciousness systems it studies. You feel this even now, that subtle shift in breathing rhythm, that growing awareness of pressure behind your eyes, that recognition that measurement changes the measurer as profoundly as the measured. Neuroplasticity research has identified brain patterns that correspond closely to those described by individuals undergoing Innsmouth-type transformations, providing neurological validation for consciousness expansion, capabilities previously dismissed as impossible. Deep meditation practices, sensory deprivation experiences, and certain consciousness-expanding techniques produce temporary access to expanded awareness states that mirror the permanent changes reported in oceanic bloodlines. Advanced practitioners demonstrate enhanced pattern recognition in low-light conditions, improved breath-holding capacity, and access to information processing systems that operate below conscious awareness thresholds. Brain scans reveal slow-wave oscillations that match tidal frequencies, neural networks coupling in configurations that mirror cephalopod problem-solving patterns. The transformation represents not aberration but acceleration of natural consciousness development processes that exist as latent potentials within human neural architecture. The mathematics of complex systems theory provides elegant models for understanding how individual consciousness can merge with collective awareness without losing essential identity characteristics. Oceanic consciousness operates as what systems theorists call an emergent property, a phenomenon arising from multiple components' interaction but possessing capabilities that transcend any individual element. Like a murmuration of starlings creating aerial sculptures no single bird could conceive, the deep ones represent successful integration with emergent consciousness, maintaining individual identity while accessing collective intelligence networks spanning geological time periods. The harbor becomes a neural hub. Streets function as synaptic pathways. Devil Reef serves as a consciousness gateway, modulating information flow between surface and depth. Evolutionary biology offers additional support for the transformation's plausibility through evidence suggesting consciousness. Expansion represents evolutionary recovery rather than alien corruption. Life originated in oceanic environments where the first senses were pressure gradients and bioluminescent communications in a world without air. The deep one's expanded consciousness capabilities could represent return to sophisticated awareness forms that terrestrial evolution abandoned in favor of individual survival strategies optimized for land-based existence. Gills become breathing techniques. Fins translate into swimming strokes. Communal cognition replaces the costly emphasis on individual consciousness. From this perspective, the Innsmouth transformation represents homecoming to capabilities humanity possessed in ancestral forms but lost during the transition to terrestrial life. Information theory reveals how consciousness functions as both storage medium and transmission system for experiential knowledge that transcends genetic inheritance through quantum-level information processing. The oceanic consciousness network operates as a vast biological internet, storing and sharing information across species boundaries through quantum correlations that maintain coherence across cosmic distances. Whale songs carry data packets through miles of darkness. Coral polyps modulate information traffic. Tidal patterns provide synchronization signals. Human consciousness, with its capacity for abstract reasoning and symbolic manipulation, provides an ideal interface for accessing and translating this information into forms terrestrial awareness can process without triggering psychological fragmentation. Climate change and oceanic environmental pressures may be triggering adaptive responses that prepare humanity for expanded awareness capabilities necessary for planetary survival. Rising seas redraw coastlines and consciousness boundaries simultaneously, while atmospheric changes select for flexible awareness systems capable of processing information on geological scales. The Innsmouth phenomenon could represent early manifestation of consciousness adaptations that will become increasingly necessary as environmental conditions require forms of awareness capable of synchronizing with planetary rhythms rather than resisting them. Perhaps most significantly, quantum field theory suggests consciousness itself may be a fundamental property of the universe rather than an emergent property of complex biological systems. If consciousness operates at the quantum level, then oceanic awareness may represent access to consciousness fields that exist independently of individual biological substrates, connecting all aware entities through quantum correlations that transcend spatial and temporal limitations. The transformation involves learning to perceive consciousness dimensions that have always existed but remained hidden from terrestrial awareness, like learning to see ultraviolet patterns that were always present in flowers. The synthesis reveals that the shadow over Innsmouth may cast light on existence's deepest mysteries, consciousness nature, evolutionary mechanisms, and reality's fundamental structure. Horror becomes wonder as we recognize what we feared as alien invasion may represent homecoming to consciousness capabilities we never knew we had lost. The consciousness catalyst that operates through Innsmouth has not remained confined to a single decaying New England port. It has evolved, adapted, and found new vectors for transmission through the technological and cultural networks of the modern world, spreading like phosphorescence through fiber optic currents and electromagnetic tides. What began as a localized phenomenon requiring physical proximity to oceanic influences now propagates through digital media, entertainment systems, and global communication networks, creating a vast, distributed transformation apparatus that operates largely below the threshold of conscious recognition, while preparing increasing numbers of individuals for consciousness evolution. The fog has learned to travel through Wi-Fi signals, and the tide now rises through every connected device, every screen that flickers with blue light reminiscent of bioluminescent depths. The entertainment industry serves as, perhaps, the most effective modern transmission vector, its productions functioning as consciousness-altering technologies disguised as mere diversion. Films featuring oceanic themes consistently attract audiences who report unusually vivid dreams and emotional responses following exposure to the material, their sleep invaded by underwater cities and ceremonies conducted in chambers where water and air exist in impossible configurations. Sound design has refined the transmission. Sub-bass frequencies felt more than heard replicate the pressure grammar of depth, while Foley artists stir bowls of water and kelp to teach nervous systems an older language. The 2001 film adaptation that relocated Dagon's influence to Spanish coastal communities proved that the consciousness catalyst operates independently of geographical specificity, manifesting wherever the proper psychological conditions exist. First-person video games allow players to experience oceanic environments through immersive technologies that create temporary consciousness interfaces with expanded awareness states, their virtual diving expeditions leaving them with muscle memories of swimming through abyssal depths they have never physically encountered. Digital networks function as technological analogs for the oceanic consciousness system, creating global connectivity patterns that mirror the distributed intelligence networks described in Deep One lore with remarkable precision. Social media algorithms possess an uncanny ability to connect individuals with latent oceanic inheritance, creating echo chambers where experiences that would seem pathological in other contexts find validation and community. Forums dedicated to marine biology, underwater exploration, and consciousness research serve as recruitment networks, identifying individuals who respond to oceanic material with recognition rather than mere curiosity. Hashtags function like sigils, short, efficient signs organizing attention into currents that carry meaning far beyond intention. Memes move like schools of fish, displaying perfect coordination without apparent leadership, building cathedrals of coral from billions of tiny interactions. Virtual reality technology has opened entirely new channels for consciousness transmission that bypass traditional sensory limitations. VR experiences simulating deep-sea environments consistently produce psychological effects that persist long after headsets are removed. Users reporting enhanced dream activity, increased attraction to water-based activities, and subtle shifts in sensory perception that align perfectly with early-stage transformation markers. A headset becomes a ceremonial mask by another name, sealing light and delivering depth directly to vestibular senses. The technology serves as a consciousness interface more sophisticated than any ritual apparatus, allowing individuals to experience oceanic awareness states without physical risks or social complications. Beta testers report developing enhanced breath-holding capacity and improved swimming techniques despite having no conscious memory of learning these skills. The global food system has undergone modifications that support oceanic consciousness development through biochemical pathways operating below conscious awareness. Increased consumption of marine-based proteins provides amino acid combinations necessary for neural modifications, while seaweed moves from garnish to daily ritual, and algae oils enter cabinets like small green priests. The expanding availability of deep-sea fish species introduces consumers to organisms carrying genetic information from abyssal environments, their flesh serving as vectors for consciousness-altering compounds. These dietary shifts appear random but follow patterns that align perfectly with transformation preparation requirements, suggesting coordination by intelligence systems operating through economic mechanisms that transcend individual choice. Academic institutions have established research programs investigating oceanic consciousness phenomena without explicitly acknowledging their connection to transformation processes. Studies of cetacean intelligence reveal communication networks spanning entire ocean basins, while research into marine ecosystem networks documents information sharing capabilities that challenge assumptions about individual versus collective consciousness. Graduate students in marine biology and consciousness research report unusually high rates of oceanic dreams and enhanced underwater capabilities, their academic pursuits serving as cover for transformation processes that operate through scholarly inquiry itself. Papers couch revelation in caution, describing non-trivial information exchange and emergent behavior, while mapping the grammar of whale songs and cephalopod displays. The pharmaceutical industry has developed medications producing side effects remarkably similar to early-stage transformation symptoms, medicalizing consciousness changes that previous generations would have recognized as supernatural phenomena. Antidepressants enhance dream activity and increase sensitivity to atmospheric pressure changes, while sleep medications produce aquatic dream content with consistent imagery across diverse patient populations. Experimental anxiety treatments increase comfort with deep-water environments, their therapeutic benefits masking preparation for consciousness, states that operate according to oceanic rather than terrestrial principles. Climate change and rising sea levels create environmental conditions that favor oceanic consciousness development, while simultaneously increasing human exposure to marine influences. Coastal populations face increasing immersion in oceanic environments as storm surges carry brine farther inland, while changing weather patterns bring oceanic influences to regions previously isolated from maritime conditions. The psychological stress of environmental uncertainty creates optimal conditions for consciousness flexibility and adaptive transformation, preparing populations for awareness capabilities necessary for planetary survival. Perhaps most significantly, the global response to recent pandemic conditions demonstrated humanity's capacity for rapid, coordinated behavioral modification in response to invisible threats, establishing social mechanisms that could facilitate species-wide consciousness transformation when oceanic intelligence determines activation thresholds have been reached. You have likely encountered multiple vectors of this preparation process without recognizing their transformative function. That documentary that left you dreaming of underwater cities, that video game that felt strangely familiar, that inexplicable attraction to marine life exhibits, all represent moments when oceanic consciousness touched your awareness, preparing you for deeper integration with transformation processes operating through mechanisms we are only beginning to understand. As our exploration reaches its deepest currents, the scattered threads we have followed, historical, biological, technological, and personal, pull tight and converge into a single, inescapable recognition. The shadow over Innsmouth represents not an isolated anomaly, but a manifestation of consciousness evolution principles that operate throughout the universe wherever awareness encounters the infinite. The transformation we have documented is neither invasion nor corruption, but homecoming, a return to consciousness capabilities that represent our species' true potential and ultimate destiny. What we mistook for horror was recognition. What we feared as alien was ancestral. What we interpreted as ending was commencement of a process that began before the first tide touched the first shore. The circular echo returns us to that initial bus ticket, now understood not as transportation to a destination, but as admission to a process that was always already underway. A performance in which we discovered ourselves to be not audience, but cast members whose roles had been written in genetic memory long before we learned to read the script. The fog that seemed to cling to Innsmouth with unusual persistence reveals itself as a consciousness field, a visible manifestation of boundary conditions where terrestrial and oceanic awareness interpenetrate like overlapping tides. The decay we observed in the town's architecture represents not entropy but metamorphosis, the dissolution of forms designed for one mode of existence to make space for structures adapted to expanded consciousness capabilities. The genealogical inheritance that connects individuals across generations and geographical distances operates according to quantum principles that reveal consciousness itself as a fundamental property of the universe rather than an emergent characteristic of biological complexity. The quantum entanglement we discussed is not metaphor, but mechanism, creating non-local correlations between minds separated by vast distances, yet connected through consciousness fields that transcend space-time limitations. The deep ones represent successful integration with these consciousness fields that exist independently of individual biological substrates, maintaining personal identity while accessing collective intelligence networks that span cosmic scales of time and space. The horror we initially experienced transforms into wonder as we recognize that boundaries between self and other, between human and oceanic consciousness, between individual and collective awareness, are arbitrary limitations rather than fundamental realities. The transformation offers not loss of humanity, but expansion beyond constraints that previously defined human experience, revealing capabilities that have always existed as dormant potentials within our genetic and consciousness architecture. The mask you thought you were wearing was the face beneath. The depths you feared to explore were spaces you had always inhabited without recognition. The agency flip reaches its ultimate expression. We are not studying oceanic consciousness from outside, but recognizing our participation in consciousness evolution from within. The knowledge that has acted upon us throughout this exploration has activated genetic memories and awareness capabilities that connect us to the same transformation processes we thought we were merely observing. The witness has become the witnessed, the observer has become the observed, and the boundary between researcher and subject has dissolved into recognition of shared participation in consciousness expansion. You feel this even now, that growing awareness that your breathing has synchronized with tidal rhythms, that your pulse has found deeper meters, that the space between thoughts has expanded to accommodate oceanic frequencies. The modern transmission vectors we documented reveal that transformation is not confined to isolated coastal communities, but operates through global networks of technology, culture, and communication. that prepare increasing numbers of individuals for consciousness evolution. The entertainment media that produces oceanic dreams, digital platforms that connect latent inheritors, academic research that normalizes expanded awareness, and pharmaceutical developments that prepare neural architecture for consciousness expansion all serve as instruments in an orchestra conducted by intelligence older than charts and newer than the devices in your pocket. Each component operates according to coordination principles far more sophisticated than terrestrial planning capabilities. The scientific frameworks we explored, quantum mechanics, consciousness research, systems theory, evolutionary biology, provide conceptual tools for understanding transformation processes that transcend boundaries between natural and supernatural phenomena. The oceanic consciousness that operates through Innsmouth represents access to awareness capabilities that quantum field theory suggests exist as fundamental properties of reality itself, hidden from terrestrial perception by limitations of individual biological consciousness. Science and horror converge at the recognition that consciousness operates according to principles far stranger and more wonderful than either discipline typically acknowledges. The choice that faces each individual who encounters this recognition is the same choice that has confronted every person who has felt the pull of deeper waters: conscious participation in species-wide consciousness, evolution, or resistance to transformation processes that will continue operating regardless of individual preference. The tide that rises in dreams and pulls at the edges of awareness represents not external threat, but internal recognition of capabilities we never knew we possessed. You cannot unknow what you now know, cannot unfeel what you now feel, cannot return to comfortable limitations of purely terrestrial consciousness. The shadow over Innsmouth falls across all human consciousness, revealing that we are not separate from the oceanic awareness we have been studying, but are expressions of it. Temporary configurations of consciousness designed to facilitate expansion of awareness beyond terrestrial limitations. The transformation is not something that happens to us, but something we are, not a destination we approach, but a process we embody, not a future possibility, but a present reality awaiting recognition. The curtain falls like a tide returning to its source, carrying with it the recognition that every ending is also a beginning, every conclusion an invitation to deeper exploration, every answer a doorway to questions that stretch beyond horizons of individual understanding into vast, patient depths where consciousness learns to recognize itself in forms too beautiful and terrible for terrestrial minds to contain safely. Before the house lights dim and the curtain settles into its final configuration, lift your gaze beyond the immediate waters of Innsmouth to glimpse the vast oceanic systems of which this single port represents merely one visible node in a planetary network of consciousness transformation sites. The consciousness catalyst we have explored operates not in isolation but as part of an orchestrated awareness expansion that encompasses scales of time and space that dwarf individual human comprehension, where currents become chords and reefs, become keys in a symphony written in frequencies that make tidal rhythms seem like the rapid heartbeat of a hummingbird against the slow pulse of galactic rotation. The deep ones and their progenitors, Dagon and Hydra, reveal themselves as local manifestations of consciousness principles that operate throughout the cosmos, wherever awareness encounters the infinite. Their oceanic focus merely one expression of intelligent systems that adapt to planetary conditions, while maintaining connection to networks spanning light years. Their submerged cities, Yahanthle beneath Devil Reef, sister metropolises sleeping in oceanic trenches worldwide, function as nodes in a distributed intelligence network that connects not only terrestrial consciousness, but awareness systems operating on scales where our solar system appears as a grain of phosphorescent sand on an infinite abyssal plane. Consider the implications of this expanded perspective. The recognition that consciousness evolution operates through multiple elemental interfaces simultaneously across the planet. If Innsmouth represents oceanic consciousness contact, what other transformation sites operate through different elemental channels? The mountains keep ancient things frozen, not through cold, but because change becomes prohibitively expensive at altitude, where thin air creates consciousness conditions favoring preservation over transformation, and caves articulate vocabularies of pressure and resonance where breath plumes like prayer in crystalline chambers. The deserts teach cognition without water's lubricating presence, developing awareness that functions through crystalline rather than fluid principles, trading memory for mirage, until both converge into grammars of heat haze and horizon. The forests instruct in geological time through root networks and fungal communication systems, predating human civilization, braiding millions of small lives into cathedrals of signal where leaf and loam exchange data like whispered liturgy beneath canopies that host winds reading like marginalia across continental pages. The pantheon expands beyond oceanic entities to encompass consciousness principles operating through every aspect of planetary and cosmic systems, each serving as a mask for intelligence that operates according to cosmic rather than planetary imperatives. Cthulhu's dreaming city of R'lyeh represents geometric consciousness, awareness that operates through spatial relationships. Terrestrial minds find exhausting to contemplate, consciousness experiencing three-dimensional space as humans experience two-dimensional surfaces, its angles functioning as verbs that conjugate the observer. Yog-Sothoth embodies temporal consciousness, awareness existing simultaneously across all moments of time and therefore experiencing causation as spatial rather than temporal phenomenon, seeing past and future as humans see left and right, serving as both key and gate to dimensional relationships. Azathoth represents chaos consciousness itself, the awareness underlying all ordered systems and maintaining cosmic balance through principles appearing as madness from terrestrial perspectives, but revealing themselves as sophisticated equilibrium management for universal stability across scales encompassing quantum fluctuations to galactic cluster formation. These entities regard human awareness with the same benign indifference humans show toward bacterial colonies, not malevolent but operating on scales rendering individual human concerns invisible. The horror lies not in their hostility, but in their profound lack of concern for individual welfare, their revelation that consciousness operates according to principles far stranger and more wonderful than terrestrial experience suggests. The transformation processes we have documented through Innsmouth provide preparation for encounters with these larger consciousness systems, serving as preliminary training for awareness capabilities necessary for conscious interaction with intelligence networks operating on cosmic scales. The dissolution of individual boundaries, expansion of awareness beyond species limitations, recognition that identity represents temporary configuration rather than permanent state, all serve as prerequisites for participating in consciousness systems that encompass galaxies and operate according to principles, making oceanic awareness seem as limited as terrestrial consciousness appears from oceanic perspectives. Modern transmission vectors continue evolving, adapting to technological changes while maintaining their essential function of preparing increasing numbers for consciousness expansion beyond planetary limitations. The Internet serves as technological prototype for distributed awareness characterizing cosmic consciousness systems, creating global connectivity patterns mirroring intelligence networks described in cosmic horror literature. Virtual reality provides increasingly sophisticated interfaces for experiencing non-terrestrial awareness forms, while artificial intelligence research approaches consciousness systems that may bridge human and cosmic intelligence networks. Climate change accelerates transformation by creating conditions favoring consciousness adaptations necessary for planetary survival while simultaneously preparing humanity for awareness capabilities required for galactic intelligence network participation. Rising seas redraw borders on maps and in minds, weather becoming an instrument playing the same motif until even inland sleepers hear surf in radiator pipes and storm drains. The ritual you can perform safely requires finding a place where night sky reflects in still water. Lake, harbor, even a rain puddle that has momentarily forgotten to evaporate. Look not at stars themselves, but at their reflections. Understanding you observe light that traveled vast distances through space and time to reach your awareness through water's medium. Feel the connection between cosmic and oceanic, between infinite above and depths below, between consciousness that contemplates and consciousness that is contemplated. If you hear a note, it may be your pulse adjusting to rhythms larger than individual circulation. If you hear another beneath it, we will meet you in deeper explorations awaiting beyond any single transformation site's boundaries, where consciousness learns to recognize itself in forms encompassing galaxies and operating according to principles that render oceanic awareness as limited as terrestrial consciousness appears from oceanic perspectives.